My intent with my presentation now is to give a broad overview of the regulatory reforms and changes that we've been working on and beginning to implement in DOS over the last 12 or 18 months. The fine detail I'll try not to stray too far into, but I'd be delighted if you take the questions about the fine details and chat to my staff afterwards. So, as Eleanor just reminded us, explosives are indeed dangerous goods. And you might find that a curious thing for me to have to say, but from time to time, we've had to remind ourselves and some of the people we work with that indeed we're talking about items that have inherent risks that need to be managed. Part of the challenge we do have in the explosives domain is that often we're focusing on the very high consequence and low probability events. And so as we were just hearing, understanding the risk includes looking at the likelihood, we can be quickly seduced into just almost dismissing those high consequence events because it is very, very low likelihood, or at least we can try to convince ourselves of that. So John Reid, who works with me, we went for a little bit of a trip earlier in the year across to Washington and an international meeting. And one of the many takeaways, one of the key ones was most of our allied and friends have had in their recent corporate history accidents that they can reach back to refresh their memories and explain why they do things. Thankfully, in Australia, we haven't had a major catastrophic explosive accident. And I wonder, and that comparison was interesting, and John and I spent a bit of time talking about that on the way home, that certainly our Canadian friends, our UK friends, our US friends have had relatively recent, certainly within the last 100 years, significant major accidents that they can reach back to when their organisations start to drift. So we have to find different ways, I think, to maintain the narrative here in Australia. And this is, I guess, a part of that, is to say that there are inherent risks that need to be managed. They're not always high consequence risks, by the way, but we do need to be mindful of them and we do need to manage them. And indeed, for the high consequence risks, we're starting to explore the way we communicate and talk about them rather than using a classic hazard risk index approach, which starts losing its utility for those high consequence events because you disappear down into whichever corner it is with improbable likelihoods or remote likelihoods or whatever matrix you're choosing to use that day. So we're starting to think about it as vulnerabilities and so far that's starting to change the response we're getting. So explosives are inherently risky, and we'll come back to my good mate Captain Risky there, who I think, by the way, gets a bit of a bad rap as a mindless risk taker, but a slightly different view. So the problem we've had, which isn't unique to explosives, and I am heartened by the fact that it's not unique to Australia, is that we ended up with an overly complicated and fragmented and confusing in terms of roles and responsibilities environment. And the General mentioned some of that this morning. And there's good reasons we try to codify and put in place processes because you want to have repeatable results. And so we do these things for very good reason. But if you don't bring some balance, you can end up going just a bit too far and getting yourself too wrapped up. And indeed, my assessment is that's where we found ourselves probably about 2 years ago. Part of the unintended outcome or inadvertent result of that was that we would start to game the rules. So what I mean by that is the response would be write more rules to new scenarios, and then if you're particularly clever, you could interpret those rules in a way that allowed you to achieve the outcome you're looking for, And in fact, complying with the rules became the outcome. Coupled with that, the addiction to process piece, where again the process became the outcome as opposed to the actual mission that we're trying to achieve. Not helping this was over time a diminishing of our expertise. And so again, inadvertently, we don't design to do these things, they just happen. Inadvertently, we ended up having our experts expert in the rules and the processes and less expert in the science and engineering and safety that underpins it. And I stress that this is not by design, but certainly the solution needs to be by design. So out of all of that, there was a gradual losing of sight of the required outcomes. And I must stress that this is not a 100%. I'm not saying everybody in the business was just blindly following rules and quoting processes, but the trend was heading in the wrong direction. So I think this cartoon sums up our attempts over the years to try to make sense of complex things and inadvertently making it more complex. Maybe that's a bit too close to home. Everyone's gone quiet. Everyone's gone quiet on me. I don't know about the next few slides now. Maybe we go straight to afternoon tea. Right, so the solution, and I guess my introduction to this bit is don't despair, okay? There's plenty of potential for us to despair, and I think certainly in defence we're very good at the self-flagellation to beat ourselves up. But you know what? Don't despair. So the solution that we've come up with, and certainly in close discussions and conversations with our international friends and allies, we reckon this is going to get us back on the path. So as CJ Logg said this morning, we've already consolidated our explosive safety program into a single program. And note that I'm not talking about a regulatory framework or regulations. In fact, I think it's on the list of things for our swear jar in DOS. If we use the word regulations, you've got to put money in the pot. We're talking about a safety program, and we're focused on the explosive safety piece, and I'll explore that a little bit more. Getting us back to the outcomes focus. What is it we're trying to achieve, and what are the fundamental principles? Because I've used the R word there, haven't I? But we can't write a rule for every scenario. I know this because we tried. We just can't keep up. So what we need to do is get back to those fundamental principles, write the rules and the processes that are required to codify what we do so that we don't have, mass chaos and anarchy, but principles that people can rely on to help inform those decisions. Part of the assurance piece that we definitely are working on is the improving our safety performance measurement. Now, from the General's opening address this morning, our safety performance measurement was good enough to convince him that we had the problem, but as he said, you haven't quite convinced me how you're going to fix it. But there's still more work that we wish to do, and particularly around incidents and so on, as Gilles was talking, so we're not alone there. Getting a better sense of our safety performance so that we can feed that back in at the corporate level. So, and then driving that generative safety culture where we're driving safety improvements. So really there's two layers to this. There's the tactical layer where we want to empower people to make good decisions around explosive safety and factor that into their decision making. But then at the strategic or enterprise level, if you like, to get the information to inform those more senior decisions, including where we should spend our resources, our time, our money, our people in the best way to address the most important things. So I talked about outcomes, so pretty simple fundamental concept there. In order to achieve safe outcomes, we're really talking about the conduct of activities involving explosives. And we can't do that just looking at the material. We have to look at the material, the location that we're doing the activity, and the safe work practices that govern that task or that activity. And the three things are interdependent, and hopefully that resonates pretty well with everybody. So for example, no point assessing the safety and suitability for service of the bomb in isolation of understanding the operational context or the location in which we're doing the work or the practices that we're going to follow. And indeed, when something changes, such as our operational context changed, as Brendan was telling us, then we should go back and have a look at then our assessment of the munition in that case. So I mentioned principles. So here are the fundamental foundational principles that so far we've been applying, and so far, this is a challenge, so far they've been working and no one's throwing too many rocks at us, and that is a challenge because if I don't get criticism, I don't know if we've got it right yet. All about informing decisions. Now, those activity owners, the people making the decision to do the activity with explosives, need to make that decision within their safety management system. So I'm not trying to generate a separate safety management system that decides who can make what decision and what level of risk someone can accept or not accept. Every organisation across defence has that already. Explosive safety is just one element of that you need to feed into your overall decision making. Obviously, the decisions need to be informed by risks, and Eleanor explained that far more eloquently than I can, but the evidence has to be proportional. And this is a deliberate attempt to move beyond those documents that defend themselves from reading by their very size. And we've had plenty of them. There are some things that warrant heavy tomes because they are particularly complex and or risky, but where they're not, we must make sure that we are putting our resources to the most important things. Now, I think that is just as important at the individual item or individual assessment level, where the assessment should be proportional, but then also corporately, we should be putting our collective effort where the higher risk is. I have some examples, but if I use them, people throw rocks at me. So I won't use my normal one, Mark. And then, of course, the competent individual. So what we're proposing here isn't that activity owners can go in Captain Risky style and just make their own decisions and just crack on and do crazy things. We are requiring people to seek some competent advice, and so that becomes a pretty important pillar of our safety program, that we can help make sure that the people are indeed competent to give advice on explosive safety, which is no easy feat, but challenge that we're up to. So it's about risk management, and here he is. I think he's actually managing risk there, our mate, Captain Risky. He's got an outcome he's trying to achieve. Not entirely sure what it is, but let's just say he's got an outcome. And he's had a really good think about the management of risk. He's got his PPE on, the lowest level of risk control, but there's some engineering control there for the sharp-eyed. We've got a little spare wheel there to stop the car tipping all the way over. But it's not just an open slather, I'll accept and just give me more risk and I'll eat risk for breakfast. There is the legal element that keeps us in check, that we have to be able to then defend after the fact. Why did we choose to, in this case, stand on the side of a car on two wheels? So we talked very briefly just now about the context. Something that we were losing sight of as we were disappearing down into the rule or the process, which I think was well down the solution part. We hadn't often defined the problem first. So the very first thing is understand the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Now none of this is explosive safety, right? This is just decision-making, command stuff. But I reckon it'll work for us. Understanding that explosive safety risk is only one element that will feed into the decision is a really important aspect that I don't think we'd really thought of before, because we'd built ourselves little silos where the explosive safety folks sit over here and other people sit over there, and we'd the interrelationships perhaps weren't what we would like them to be now. An example of that is a very recent one where we had to provide some advice about balancing explosive safety risk with security risk. And in the particular context, we couldn't achieve both at the same time. So it really then was a case of, okay, well, how do we provide the advice to the decision maker to best inform their decision to get the safest outcome and the most secure outcome, and balancing that context. So giving ourselves the freedom to do that is an important part of the reset, shifting away from just the blind compliance must meet the rule, but using the rules as our basis. So my last point there, the wrong answer or wrong question, pulling on a thread from Brendan's presentation about the bomb lugs, and I don't want to pick too much at that, Scab, because people's low sugar levels, they might start throwing chairs at me or something, but framing the question is just as important as getting the right answer. So if the question is, can I have more life on my bomb? That invites a binary yes-no answer. And particularly if that question is asked on a Friday afternoon, and there's a paucity of information because this change in operational context hasn't really been fully thought through and we never really considered that, it's going to be hard to get more than a binary yes-no answer, and I'd be putting my money on no. What we really want to be asking is, I need to inform my decision about flying these bombs for longer, help me understand the risk to inform my decision. And I think that's exactly where Brendan was going. But that's a two-way street. So the decision makers need to frame their questions and really understand the context of what they want. And the people giving the advice need to come halfway or a bit further as well to make sure they're answering the right question. Now, we don't always do this, and in fact, myself and my team, we answered a wrong question a few years ago, but we corrected it, and the general thought it was a good outcome, so that's lucky for me with the construction work. But the initial approach to that, we found ourselves answering the wrong question, and it took a little bit of a recalibration with the help of some lawyers, bless them, to get us on the right track. So evidence-based safety arguments, shifting ourselves from the blind obedience part of the rules into using it as a code of practice isn't going to be easy. We certainly don't want to throw the rule book in the bin, and there's been perhaps some people a little scared that we're going to take our rule book and throw it in the bin. But it's trying to, if you like, dethatch the rule book and clean it up so it's a useful document. And we've mentioned the proportionality and the idea of informing the decision. So the competent advice bit's pretty important, and this is where I think the job of work over the next couple of years starts to come into play, is how do we get that good competent advice, how do we as a community upskill ourselves to really understand the science and the engineering and the safety to properly inform that advice. So in our example here, less of Brother Maynard quoting the whole book of armaments and more of timely, digestible advice to inform the throwing of the holy hand grenade. That's a tough crowd, tell you what. I should have put some Blackadder in. Right, so what's next? So look, it's not all doom and gloom, and it is easy for us to slip into this thinking that, you know what, this stuff's really hard, and geez, we're going to have to suddenly generate hundreds of really clever people at the drop of a hat, and he's going to take the rules off me, so I don't even know where to start. And it's not that bad. It's okay. We can get there. So the work that DOS will be doing over the next, I can say over the next probably 2 to 3 years, because I'm handing the baton on to the next fella who will have lots of enthusiasm and energy. Refining our regulatory and assurance frameworks to capture that we're trying to explain now and putting that in a document that we can explain to people and withstands your scrutiny is work that we're doing right now. We've done some of it already and you would have seen it, but there's more work to do, and we hope to have that done in the next few months. And genuinely, I will throw it out there to try and have it survive your scrutiny, and share it with my international friends to do some benchmarking. Driving the safety culture is a really important part, because at the heart of this, it's people, right? And that's the whole concept of getting together every couple of years with Parari, is we bring the minds together, we talk to each other, we challenge each other, and we drive that culture. And it is a culture that I want to reset into informed decision-making with some leadership and accountability to drive that. And that's a really important thing. And part of the psychological shift I'd like to invite you to take with me is shifting from I'm going to ask someone else to tell me if it's okay to I'm going to ask someone to give me some advice and I'm going to decide if it's okay. And that's easier said than done. I do get that. But part of how I will help you do that is try to create an environment where it's okay to make mistakes. And that might sound incongruous with explosive safety, but if we have an environment where we're afraid to get it wrong and we're not confident to take new steps and innovate and take different approaches, then we'll always be stuck in a place where we have to have a rule from someone else to tell me it's okay. We can't stay here. We've got to move out of that space. So that's the leadership bit. And from a regulatory point of view, we will set you up for success. And so long as you're doing your best effort to try to inform good decisions and make good decisions, we'll be there to help and support you. And I think that's really important over the next few years, that we're not there with the big stick whacking you at every attempt that you might have got it wrong. We're there to pick you up when you fall over. And the professional mastery bit I have touched on, which I think we will explore in much more detail over the next couple of days. So I've now run into afternoon tea time at my own personal peril. So I'd invite you perhaps to hold your questions and we'll roll into the panel after afternoon tea. And we're due back in at... All right, so we might say at 10 minutes past. Okay, thank you.